Sienna God, hello all. Osha Sahiya, good evening, Awado. Thank you for watching. This is day 18, part B of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. I'm going to reread this small paragraph. Well, I mean, it's just like one long sentence because it's fixing to lead into an excerpt. Partly this reflected a changing mix of students as colleges, black and white, drew on a border social range after the Second World War, partly as a result of the availability of financial support from the GI Bill. Right in the middle of the 20th century, Fraser said, the average Negro who enters a Negro college has had little contact with books and has not developed reading habits. Moreover, when he enters college, he does not find an atmosphere where educational values and scholarship are highly respected. Okay. Fraser described the new black college students as quote-unquote listless, and, in quotes, less concerned with the history or understanding of the world around them than with their appearance at the next social affair. Absolutely, end quote. Moreover, such concerns are supported by the new generation of administrators. The girl with a peasant or working class background may be irritated by her mother's inability to buy an expensive quote-unquote party dress. But what can be expected when the dean of women has instructed her to tell her mother that she must have the dress at any sacrifice? Oh, wow. That's true. As for the faculty, Professor Fraser described them this way in the middle of the 20th century. Unlike the missionary teachers, the present teachers have little interest in, quote-unquote, making men, but are concerned primarily with teaching as a source of income, which will enable them to maintain middle-class standards and participate in Negro, quote-unquote, society. It appears that the majority of them have no knowledge of books nor any real love of literature. Today, many of the teachers of English and literature never read a book as a source of pleasure or recreation. Oh, yeah. You know, when I told people that, like, I love to learn, I never stop learning, right? That I'm always, like, reading something. Like, but, like, were you made to read that? Like, do you have to read that? Is that a qualification for your job? Or they couldn't freaking wrap their minds around, like, reading a book to read it, you know? And they're like, oh no, like it was completely appalling to them and like totally out of this world. It was like the craziest thing. It'd be like trying to tell them the sky's purple. Oh yeah, I just believe the sky's purple. Up is down, right is left. You know what I mean? And they're like, what is wrong with you? You know what I mean? And I'm thinking, what's wrong with you? I want to know. I want to learn. I want to be educated. Anyway. In short, the black colleges retrogressed toward the black redneck culture. All right. The stultifying, stultifying, and anti-intellectual atmosphere on many black college campuses has been described with painful frankness in Professor Fraser's 1958 book. 1958. And you see what's going on now. It's like it's on the stinking internet, right? And it's not AI, right? I gotta adjust this real quick. It's not AI, and it's from the latest graduations. Look it up. When I first saw it, it came across my Twitter feed. So I haven't listened to any podcast about it or anything like that because I don't need to. I think I know what I'm looking at. You know what I mean? Like, come on. Let's see here. Okay, 1958 book Black Bourgeoisie by black novelist Ralph Ellison. And that's Bourgeoisie. In The Invisible Man, and by white scholars Christopher Jenks, Jenks, and David Reisman, Riesman, in a comprehensive 1967 article in the Harvard Educational Review, which may well have been the last honest study of black colleges. Ooh, given the rising racial militancy, yes, and the automatic labeling of white critics as racist, right? And then if you get a minority to say something, they're like, he's working for the white man. You know what I mean? And it's like, get off the Kool-Aid. Anyhow, there have been no black college equivalents of Dunbar High School or other high-achieving black elementary and secondary schools. One major historic difference between black colleges and Dunbar High School was the highly qualified, if not overqualified, early leadership of Dunbar and the underqualified first generation of black leadership of the black colleges. The latter put in place for purposes of symbolic racial representation. There were enduring consequences to the different calibers of people who shaped these different institutions in their formative stages and set in motion values and priorities which shaped and selected their successors in the generations ahead. In a much later era, beginning in the 1960s, a similar setting up of black studies departments in predominantly white colleges across the country with little or no regard to the wholly inadequate numbers of academically qualified people to staff so many departments established simultaneously likewise put in place a first generation of black academics who would lead such departments in a non-academic or even anti-intellectual directions. Even though there was no inherent reason why the scholarly study of the history, economics, politics, or sociology of black Americans could not be a serious enterprise. In practice, black studies programs by and large became noted for shoddy standards for both students and faculty. It is doubtful whether so many academic departments could be set up simultaneously in any academic field without exhausting the pool of qualified faculty members, but no one attempted such a thing in traditional academic departments. As with many of the black colleges, the inadequacies of the black pioneers and black studies warped the future. Even after those pioneers passed from the scene and better qualified people became available, by the same token, the kinds of highly qualified people who shaped the future Dunbar High School in its formative years left an enduring legacy of high standards and performances. When I was reading that and I started tripping up, is because I was literally thinking about how, like, people would say stuff like, if somebody actually gave a good gosh dang about, being there and shaping the next generations and all that kind of stuff, you'd have your people that were like, Mr. Such is just doing too much or whatever. You know what I mean? It's like, what? But they're like literally trying to invest their time and effort and a lot of times their money into your future. I really could care less if the professor is somebody who has poor bedside manner. You know what I mean? Like how doctors, like they'll have like a poor bedside manner, but I don't know what you say. A poor school desk manner? I don't know. Anyway, classroom manner? I don't know. But they kind of just rub you the wrong way. Like, you're not there to make a friend. You're literally there to get an education and fill in the blank, and it doesn't matter. Whatever you're in, if somebody's teaching you something and they're being kind of like off-putting, I'm going to tell you, it's probably not you, right? And you need to really think through what it is that they're saying and take as much notes as you can. You may be called a brown noser or whatever, but it doesn't frickin' matter. But people are taking note that you're paying attention, and they are grateful for you asking all those questions and things because they were afraid to ask it. Or they were just nervous about public speaking or whatever, or they didn't want people to start making fun of them saying that they are brown nosers themselves, right? And it doesn't matter. You're not there to make friends. Not even with the people that are in the classes with you, honey. You are there to get your education on whatever the heck it is that you signed up for. Okay? These people aren't going to be paying your bills. They're not going to be, in your life like that. Like, don't do that to yourself. You're shooting your own self in the foot. And if you're on taxpayer dime, see it as a privilege. Somebody is helping you pay that, right? And whether if you think, oh, the state's paying for it, honey, our taxes are paying for that. So just be grateful and thankful for the leg up, right? Not the hand out, the hand up, okay? And do something great with it, to make everybody that helped you proud. Anyways, white colleges. Here we go. Although black students were admitted to some white colleges, notably Oberlin, what? I'm going to mess this up. Bowdoin. Bodwin. But it looks like Bowdoin. Anyway, people have said that before, or love saying that, whatever. Hillsdale and Western Reserve. Even before the Civil War, most post-bellum black students pursued their higher education at the black colleges until the 1960s. In the decades that followed up to the present, the majority of black students have attended predominantly white colleges. Given the scarcity of black students with educational background and academic achievements, really, get out of here. I'm trying to hurry it up and get y'all some more stuff because I've been talking a lot. Let's get the good stuff. Among other students at the predominantly white colleges, these institutions' desires to secure a demographically representative student body made lower standards of admissions for blacks virtually inevitable. This problem was not confined to colleges with very high academic standards. When top-tier colleges and universities accepted black students who met the normal qualifications for second-tier institutions, similar pressures led second-tier institutions to accept black students who would normally qualify for third-tier colleges and universities, and so on down the line. With black students systemically mismatched with academic institutions across the spectrum, it can hardly be surprising that most black students nationwide failed to graduate. And then they use those statistics, oh man, to further prove the point, I don't know, of racial discrimination and whatever else. It's oh my gosh, you can't cut the mustard because you don't have the correct skills and things because they're improperly placing you, I feel like, for quotas and whatnot. Ugh. And that's why when you are the only minority in the classroom, you kind of feel like everybody is looking at you as the quota, right? Ugh. It happened to me one time and I totally felt that way. Jesus, couldn't they sprinkled some more of us in here? But the class was really, really hard and I can understand. And no, I was not the quota. I made it in the class. However, I didn't care for that teacher's teaching style. So I was all up in the tutoring. You know what I mean? Such negative education results repeated a pattern of bad educational results from making educational decisions on non-educational grounds that began with the creation of black colleges that were colleges in name only in the 19th century for the sake of denominational rivalry. Oh, that's terrible. And later putting underqualified people in charge of these black colleges for the sake of racial representation. Absolutely. That's just terrible. Very similar corruption and anti-intellectual consequences have followed latter-day educational policies based on demographic representation. Moreover, these consequences have endured even through turnovers of students and faculty over the years. The admission of black students with qualifications markedly lower than those of the other students at the same institutions was soon followed by hiring black faculty members with qualifications likewise lower than those of their white and Asian faculty colleagues. This was done for the same reason, namely that there were simply not enough blacks with the usual academic qualifications to achieve demographic representation any other way. How's that working out? Because that's still happening. And it ain't too good. You know what I mean? Wasn't good then, it wasn't good now. And this is the history also that needs to be known so it can stop. Seriously. Freaking knock it off. You're not there because you're qualified. You just have to know that. You know what I mean? You know that you don't know what other people are talking about. You know that the curriculum that you've been told to teach and all that, you have no idea what the heck it is. That's not by design or somebody setting you up to fail or whatever it is. It's because you're not qualified. Good gosh. Not only are there far fewer black students than Asian American students who reach the usual test score levels found at selective colleges, the shortfall is even more drastic at the postgraduate level, where future faculty members are produced. In some years, the absolute number of blacks receiving PhDs in mathematics did not reach double digits. Summary and implications. Education has played a crucial role in the advancement of blacks over the generations and in the lags of blacks behind others in the American economy. In order to understand both the lags and the advancement, it is necessary to understand the extremely low level from which the education of most black Americans began and the very long time before the great majority of blacks had the kind of education that would qualify them for many of the occupations in which education was essential. Racial discrimination barriers kept educated blacks out of some of these corruptions, but until perhaps the middle of the 20th century, there were relatively few blacks to be kept out by such barriers. Looked at differently, the dramatic increases in the numbers of blacks in many professional occupations in the last half of the 20th century cannot be attributed solely or even primarily to the removal of these barriers by civil rights legislation. The rise of blacks in a professional and other high-level occupations was greater in the years preceding passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than in the years following passage of that act. What happened was a dramatic increase in the numbers of blacks with college and postgraduate education. Prior to the First World War, fewer than 5,000 college degrees had been granted to black students in the entire history of the United States, but by 1935, that had increased fivefold. And by 1947, the black colleges alone granted in 1 year more degrees than blacks had ever received in all the years prior to the First World War. Increases in the numbers of doctorates received by blacks were also dramatic. Similarly, despite a widespread tendency to see the rise of blacks out of poverty as due to civil rights movement and government social programs of the 1960s, in reality, the rise of blacks out of poverty was greater in the 2 decades preceding 1960 than in the decades that followed. Education was a major factor in this as well. As of 1940, non-white males averaged just 5.4 years of schooling, compared to 8.7 for white males. Over the next 2 decades, hopefully I said non-white males, averaged just 5.4 years of schooling compared to 8.7 for white males. Okay, over the next 2 decades, the absolute amount of education increased for both, and the gap between them narrowed in 1940. The difference in schooling between black and white young adult males, aged 25 to 29, was 4 years, but by 1960, that had shrunk to less than 2 years. Because this was an era of massive black migration out of the South, this quantitative narrowing of the gap in schooling may well have been accompanied by a qualitative improvement as many blacks left behind the low-quality schools and the Jim Crow South. How did this translate into economic change? As of 1940, more than 4/5 of black families, 87% in fact, lived below the official poverty level. By 1960, this had fallen to 47%. In other words, the poverty rate among blacks had been nearly cut in half before either the Civil Rights Revolution or the Great Society social programs began in the 1960s. The continuation of this trend can hardly be automatically credited to these political developments, though such claims are often made, usually ignoring the pre-existing trend, whose momentum could hardly have been expected to stop in the absence of such legislation. By 1970, the poverty rate among blacks had fallen to 30%. A welcome development, but by no means unprecedented, a decade after that. With the rise of affirmative action in the intervening years, the poverty rate among black families had fallen to 29%. Even if one attributes all of this 1% decline to government policy, it does not compare to the dramatic declines in poverty among blacks when the only major change was a rise in their education. Whatever the merits of various movements and programs on other grounds, the claim that they were the primary factor in the economic advancement of blacks cannot be squared with the facts. Yet, a whole generation of black leaders, intellectuals, and activists have become committed to such movements, and programs and their accompanying rhetoric. However, Frederick Douglass warned as far back as the 1870s that blacks should, end quotes, cultivate their brains more than their cultivate their brains more and their lungs less. Yeah, end quote. Well, excuse me. No one can deny the existence of racial discrimination in employment, housing, and other areas. The assumption that the magnitude of employment discrimination can be measured by relative numbers of blacks in particular occupations ignores the huge quantitative and qualitative differences in education between blacks and whites which existed in past generations, often as a result of government discrimination in the provision of educational resources. Without an understanding of reasons for both the lags and the progress of blacks in the past, policy prescriptions for future advancement risk misplaced emphasis. More specifically, it risks underestimating the importance of the quantity and quality of education, which depends upon both students and teachers and much less on the amount of money fed into education bureaucracies or on the fads and P-A-N-A-C-E-A-S, panaceas? I don't know. That could come and go in the schools and colleges. Oh, I gotta end it there. Don't go hang again, you gonna get chance, tell me again, love you, mean it.